"Solve this equation and I'll marry you," Professor Richard Caldwell said, his voice cutting through the lecture hall with the confidence of a man who had never once been challenged, and laughter rolled across the room like a wave as 200 students leaned forward in their seats inside Whitmore Hall, the largest lecture auditorium at Westbridge University, where sunlight poured through tall windows and the faint smell of dry erase markers lingered in the air. And on the whiteboard behind him stretched a long, intimidating equation filled with symbols most students hadn't even seen before, layers of calculus and abstract mathematics that looked more like a foreign language than numbers. And Caldwell smiled, adjusting his navy blazer, clearly enjoying the moment as he added, "But I doubt anyone in this room could even start." While phones lifted quietly, students already sensing something worth recording. And in the far corner near the side aisle, Elijah Brooks pushed a quiet, cleaning cart forward, his gray uniform simple, his movements calm, the wheels of the cart barely making a sound across the polished floor, and no one paid him any attention at first, because janitors at Westbridge were invisible, part of the background, like chairs or chalk dust. But Elijah slowed as he passed the board, his eyes drifting upward for just a second longer than necessary. And then he kept moving, quietly wiping down the edge of a desk, while Caldwell continued pacing across the stage, tapping his marker against his palm. "This problem took a team at Stanford nearly 3 weeks," he said, drawing another small line under the equation. "So if anyone here thinks they can solve it in one afternoon, I'd love to see that." More laughter followed, and a few students shook their heads, some whispering that it looked impossible, while Maya Thompson, seated 3 rows from the back, glanced toward Elijah, noticing how he had stopped near the side of the board, his gaze steady, focused, not confused but thoughtful, and she leaned forward slightly, her curiosity sparked, while Caldwell continued. "Sometimes mathematics reminds us that not everyone belongs at the same level." And the words hung in the air, subtle but sharp, and Elijah reached for a cloth, wiping the corner of the whiteboard slowly, his expression calm, his posture relaxed, as if the room's tension didn't exist. While Maya noticed something else, Elijah's eyes moving across the equation step by step, like someone reading a familiar story, and her brows lifted slightly, while a few students near the aisle nudged each other, noticing the janitor standing just a little too still, and Caldwell turned, following their gaze, spotting Elijah, and for a moment he smirked, amused. "Careful there," he said lightly. "You might erase something important." And more quiet chuckles spread across the room. But Elijah simply nodded once, stepping slightly to the side. And the silence that followed felt different now. Thinner, like the room was holding its breath without knowing why. While Maya's phone hovered just above her notebook, recording quietly, and Elijah's eyes returned to the equation one more time, calm, steady, and unreadable, as the sunlight shifted across the board, and the room slowly settled into a tension no one had planned. Because something about the quiet janitor standing beside the impossible equation felt like the beginning of a story no one in that lecture hall was prepared for. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, and Professor Caldwell noticed it first because he had built his career on controlling rooms like this one, and now the attention was no longer on him, but on the quiet figure standing near the board, and Elijah Brooks moved slowly toward the far corner, adjusting the handle of his cleaning cart, as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet Maya Thompson kept watching him, her curiosity growing stronger with every second, because she had seen that look before in her high school math coach, the look of someone mentally tracing patterns invisible to everyone else. And she leaned closer to her notebook, glancing back at the board where the equation still stretched across the white surface like a challenge waiting to be answered, while Caldwell resumed his lecture, writing a few more notes beneath the equation, explaining concepts that most of the class struggled to follow, his voice steady but slightly tighter now as he tried to pull attention back to himself. "Advanced nonlinear systems rarely yield to intuition," he said, tapping the board lightly. "They require structured reasoning and years of experience." And yet several students were no longer looking at him, their eyes drifting toward Elijah, who had stopped again near the aisle, wiping down a desk, but still glancing up every few seconds. And Maya finally noticed something else, Elijah's lips moving slightly, almost as if he was counting silently, and she felt a small rush of surprise. because no one silently counted while looking at an equation like that unless they understood what they were seeing. And 2 rows ahead, a student whispered to his friend, "Is he actually trying to solve it?" And the friend shrugged, half amused, half curious, while Caldwell finished explaining a concept and turned back toward the class. "Now, as you can see, this is why problems like this remain unsolved for long periods," he continued, but his words faded slightly as he noticed the shifting attention again, and he followed their gaze once more, spotting Elijah standing near the side of the board, his cloth resting on the edge of the tray, and Caldwell let out a quiet chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. "You know, sometimes curiosity is admirable," he said, "but some things are simply outside our scope." And a few students laughed politely, though the laughter felt thinner now, less confident, and Elijah simply nodded again, calm and respectful, stepping back slightly as if giving the professor more room. Yet his eyes remained steady, and Maya's heart picked up just a little, because she realized he had not once looked confused, not once hesitated, and her phone camera tilted slightly upward, recording quietly, capturing the equation, the professor, and the quiet janitor who seemed to be calculating something no one else could see, while outside the tall windows a breeze shifted the branches of the trees lining the campus quad, sunlight flickering across the board, and the room settled into a quiet tension that grew thicker with every passing second. Because somewhere beneath the calm surface of the lecture hall, something unexpected was beginning to form, and no one yet realized that the quiet man with the cleaning cart had already taken the first step toward changing everything. Professor Caldwell turned back to the board and began explaining another layer of the equation, but the room was no longer fully with him, and he could feel it in the subtle shifts of posture and the quiet rustling of notebooks closing instead of opening. And when a lecturer loses the room, even slightly, it feels like the air itself has changed, and Caldwell tightened his grip on the marker, writing another symbol with a sharp squeak across the whiteboard. "This term here represents instability in nonlinear systems," he said, tapping the corner of the equation. But several students were not writing anymore. They were watching Elijah Brooks, who had now moved slowly along the front row, wiping desks one at a time, yet pausing every few seconds as his eyes returned to the equation. And Maya Thompson leaned forward further, her curiosity now turning into certainty, because she noticed Elijah's fingers moving lightly against the cloth, tracing invisible lines as if he were mapping steps in his head, and she whispered to the student beside her, "I think he understands it." And the student raised his eyebrows, unsure whether to laugh or agree, while Caldwell noticed the whispering and turned again, his patience thinning slightly. "If there are questions, we can address them after class," he said, but Maya did not respond, her attention still fixed on Elijah. And then something unexpected happened. Elijah set the cloth down on the tray, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small folded notepad, worn at the edges, and he flipped it open quietly, glancing up at the equation once more, and began writing slowly, carefully, his handwriting small and deliberate, and Maya's eyes widened, because that was not curiosity anymore. That was calculation, and 2 students nearby leaned forward, noticing the movement, while Caldwell continued speaking, unaware at first, until the subtle shift in attention pulled him back again, and this time he saw Elijah writing, and he paused mid-sentence, the marker hovering in the air. "Working on something?" Caldwell asked with a faint smile that carried a hint of amusement, and a few students chuckled softly. But Elijah simply nodded politely without speaking, his expression calm, respectful, and he continued writing, and the quiet confidence in his posture unsettled the room more than any bold response would have, because there was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty, just steady progression. And Maya quietly lifted her phone higher, recording now without even pretending otherwise, while Caldwell cleared his throat and resumed, though his voice felt slightly strained. "Mathematics rewards discipline," he said, but the room was already drifting further away from him, and after another minute Elijah finished a line on the notepad, paused, looked back at the board, and then turned the page, continuing, and Maya felt her pulse quicken, because she realized he was not guessing, he was solving. Step by step, and the quiet tension inside Whitmore Hall grew heavier, as sunlight shifted across the board, and the impossible equation still stood there, waiting, while the quiet janitor with the worn notepad moved one step closer to rewriting everything the room believed about who belonged at the front of the class. The quiet tension inside Whitmore Hall deepened as Elijah Brooks continued writing on the small notepad, his movements steady and deliberate, and Maya Thompson leaned forward even more, her eyes darting between the board and Elijah's notes, trying to follow what he was doing. And she realized he was rewriting the equation in a different form, simplifying sections that had seemed impossible just moments earlier. And her breath caught slightly as she whispered under her breath, "He is actually solving it." And the student beside her turned quickly, glancing at Elijah with growing curiosity, while Professor Caldwell continued speaking. Though his words began to slow, his attention repeatedly pulled toward the quiet figure at the front of the room, and after another moment Maya could not hold back any longer. She raised her hand slightly, then lowered it, realizing she did not even need permission, and she spoke just loud enough for the nearby rows to hear. "Sir, I think he is working through the equation." And the words rippled outward like a pebble dropped into still water, students turning one by one, their attention shifting fully now. And Caldwell paused, his expression tightening briefly before he forced a polite smile. "I appreciate enthusiasm," he replied calmly, "but this is not something solved casually." Yet the room had already changed, and Elijah finished another line on the notepad, then flipped the page, and this time even more students leaned forward, whispering softly, phones lifting discreetly, while Caldwell stepped closer to the board, crossing his arms, watching Elijah more openly now. And the professor's smile faded slightly as he noticed the pace of Elijah's writing, because it was not random. It followed structure, logic, progression, and Caldwell recognized the pattern immediately, the kind of pattern only someone experienced in advanced mathematics would follow. And the realization unsettled him, though he masked it behind a composed expression. "Interesting," Caldwell said lightly. "Do you believe you have something there?" And Elijah looked up for the first time, his eyes calm, respectful, and he nodded slightly without speaking, then returned to his notes. And Maya felt her heart beat faster as the room grew quieter, the earlier laughter now completely gone, replaced by anticipation, and Elijah took one small step toward the board, not fully approaching, just enough to compare his notes again, and he traced a line in the air with his finger, silently verifying the next step. And a student in the front row leaned back slowly, whispering, "He is not guessing." And another student nodded, watching closely, while Caldwell's posture stiffened slightly, his confidence beginning to feel challenged for the first time, and he tapped the marker against his palm again, the sound echoing softly in the silent lecture hall. And Elijah completed another step on his notepad, paused, then looked up once more, his expression unchanged, calm and focused. And Maya realized something else. He was almost finished, and the realization sent a quiet wave of disbelief through her as the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The silence stretched so long that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder, and Elijah Brooks lowered his notepad slowly, his eyes scanning the board one last time, as if confirming every step he had written. And Maya Thompson felt her pulse quicken because she could see it clearly now. The final line on Elijah's page matched the structure of a completed solution, and she whispered, barely audible, "He finished." And the words spread across the nearby rows, students leaning forward, shifting in their seats, the atmosphere inside Whitmore Hall tightening like a held breath, while Professor Caldwell watched carefully, his expression composed but his eyes sharper now, measuring, analyzing. And Elijah stepped closer to the board, not fully committing yet, just standing beside it, his posture calm and respectful. And Caldwell lifted an eyebrow, a faint smile returning though it felt more cautious than confident. "Do you have something you would like to share?" he asked, his voice light but carrying an edge of curiosity. And Elijah nodded slightly, his voice quiet but steady as he spoke for the first time. "May I write it?" And the simplicity of the request sent a ripple through the room, students exchanging glances, phones lifting higher, and Caldwell hesitated for a brief moment, then gestured toward the board with a small motion. "Go ahead," he said, and Elijah stepped forward, picking up the marker from the tray, his movements smooth and unhurried, and the entire lecture hall seemed to freeze as he began writing, his handwriting clean and precise, each step unfolding logically, no hesitation, no backtracking, and Maya watched in disbelief as the structure mirrored exactly what she had glimpsed on his notepad, while Caldwell's smile faded gradually, his arms crossing slowly as he followed each line, recognizing the method, recognizing the logic, and the quiet scratching of the marker became the only sound in the room, students no longer whispering, no one shifting, just watching as Elijah moved through the equation step by step, simplifying terms that had seemed immovable, reorganizing expressions that had confused even advanced students, and halfway through, a student in the front row leaned back slightly, shaking his head in disbelief, while Maya felt her hands tighten around her phone, and Elijah continued, calm and focused, until he reached the final step, and he paused for a brief second, glancing at the board, then wrote the last line, and placed the marker back on the tray gently, stepping aside without saying anything, and the room stayed silent. The solution now complete, stretching across the board where the impossible equation had once stood, and Caldwell stepped forward slowly, his expression unreadable as he examined each line carefully, his eyes moving from top to bottom, then back again, and the silence deepened as he checked the logic, the transformation, the final result, and for the first time since the lecture began, Professor Caldwell did not speak immediately, and the entire room waited as the authority at the front of the class stood motionless, staring at a solution written by the quiet janitor. Professor Caldwell leaned closer to the board, his eyes scanning every line again, slower this time, as if hoping to find a mistake hidden somewhere between the symbols, but the structure held firm, each step connected cleanly to the next, and the longer he studied it the quieter the room became, until even the faint shuffle of clothing stopped completely, and Maya Thompson watched as Caldwell's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the confidence in his shoulders softening, his jaw tightening, slightly as he traced the final line with his eyes, and he stepped back once, then forward again, reading from the beginning, and the silence stretched further, the kind of silence that fills a room when something unexpected has already happened but no one has acknowledged it yet, and Elijah Brooks stood quietly to the side, hands resting calmly near his cleaning cart, his expression neutral, respectful, offering no reaction, and that calm seemed to amplify the moment even more, because he did not appear proud or nervous, just steady. And finally Caldwell spoke, his voice lower than before. "How did you arrive at this substitution?" he asked, pointing to the middle of the solution, and Elijah answered. "Simply, the instability cancels when you restructure the nonlinear term," and the clarity of the explanation caused several students to exchange stunned looks, because the explanation was not just correct, it was elegant, and Caldwell nodded slowly, his eyes moving again across the board, and he tested another step, then another, his fingers tapping lightly against his arm as he verified the logic, and after another long moment, he exhaled quietly, almost as if the air had finally left his lungs, and Maya felt her heart race as she realized what that meant, and a student near the front whispered, "It is right," and the whisper spread across the rows, quiet disbelief turning into a wave of murmurs, and Caldwell turned slowly toward Elijah, his expression now serious, the earlier amusement completely gone. "That is correct," he said, and the words landed heavier than anyone expected, and the room shifted instantly, students leaning forward, some shaking their heads, others raising their phones higher, and Elijah simply nodded once, calm as before, and Caldwell studied him for another moment, his curiosity now overtaking everything else. "Where did you learn mathematics like this?" he asked, and Elijah paused briefly, as if choosing his words carefully, then answered in the same quiet tone, "I used to work with systems like this," and the understatement hung in the air, deepening the mystery, while Maya felt a chill of anticipation, because she realized this was only the beginning, and Caldwell glanced back at the board once more, then at Elijah again, as if reassessing everything he thought he understood about the quiet man standing beside the cleaning cart, and the entire lecture hall waited, sensing that something even bigger was about to unfold. The room remained suspended in quiet anticipation as Professor Caldwell studied Elijah Brooks more closely, his eyes narrowing slightly, not with skepticism now, but with growing recognition, and Caldwell stepped forward. Again, glancing once more at the completed solution, then back at Elijah. You used a restructuring method that is not commonly taught, he said carefully, and Elijah nodded once, calm as ever. It was part of my research, he replied, and the word research landed differently this time, pulling another ripple of curiosity through the lecture hall, and Maya Thompson felt her pulse quicken again, because the quiet janitor standing beside the cleaning cart no longer seemed invisible. He seemed deliberate, composed, as though he had been standing in front of lecture halls long before this one. And Caldwell tilted his head slightly. Research where? He asked, and Elijah paused for a moment, then answered in the same steady tone. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the effect was immediate, the room shifting as whispers broke out across the rows, several students exchanging stunned looks, while Caldwell blinked once, clearly taken off guard. You studied there? He asked, and Elijah nodded slightly. I taught there, he corrected calmly, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything before, Maya's eyes widening as her phone captured the moment, and Caldwell's posture stiffened subtly, his confidence replaced now with genuine surprise. You taught at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he repeated slowly, as if confirming what he had just heard, and Elijah gave a small nod. Applied mathematics, he added quietly, and the quiet authority in his voice shifted the entire atmosphere of Whitmore Hall, students leaning forward, some whispering in disbelief, while Caldwell glanced once more at the board, the solution now carrying even greater weight, and before he could speak again, the lecture hall doors opened softly at the back of the room, and a man in a dark suit stepped inside, scanning the rows briefly before walking down the aisle with measured steps, and a few students turned to watch, sensing something unusual, while Maya followed the movement with her phone still recording, and the man approached the front of the room, stopping near Elijah. Mr. Brooks, he said respectfully, the president is ready for you. And the words landed quietly but decisively, and Caldwell turned fully toward Elijah, his expression shifting from surprise to realization, while the suited man continued, They are waiting for you in the boardroom. And Elijah nodded once, calm and composed, and Caldwell looked between them, his earlier confidence now completely gone, and the entire lecture hall seemed to lean forward as the quiet janitor who had just solved the impossible equation stood beside a university official who addressed him with unmistakable respect. And in that moment the room understood that the story was far from over. The words lingered in the air as Elijah Brooks gave a small nod to the man in the dark suit, his calm demeanor unchanged, and the room watched as he reached for the handle of his cleaning cart, then paused, as if remembering something unfinished, and he turned slightly toward the board, his eyes resting briefly on the completed solution, while Professor Caldwell remained still, his posture rigid, the shift in authority now unmistakable. And the suited man spoke again with quiet respect. They have been waiting for your approval on the new research funding. And several students exchanged stunned looks, the meaning becoming clearer with every passing second, while Maya Thompson felt her heart racing as she realized the quiet janitor was not simply visiting the boardroom. He was being called to make decisions that shaped the university itself. And Elijah nodded once more, then gently pushed the cleaning cart aside, stepping forward, and Caldwell finally spoke, his voice measured but noticeably different from before. Mr. Brooks, he said, and the name sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, as though he were adjusting to a new reality. You are involved with the university administration, and Elijah turned toward him, calm and composed. I joined the board last year, he replied simply, and the words settled across the lecture hall like a quiet shockwave, students leaning forward, whispers spreading quickly. While Caldwell blinked again, the earlier confidence replaced by careful understanding, and the suited man added, he also funded the new mathematics research wing. And a few students gasped softly, recognizing the building that had opened just months earlier, and Maya's eyes widened further as the pieces connected. The quiet janitor who had been wiping desks minutes ago was the same person whose name appeared on the plaque outside the most advanced research facility on campus. And Caldwell glanced at the board again, then back at Elijah, his expression shifting into something closer to respect, and Elijah gave a small, polite nod, then turned slightly as if preparing to leave. But before stepping away, he looked once more at the lecture hall, his gaze calm and steady, and the room remained silent, watching as the quiet figure who had entered unnoticed now stood at the center of a moment none of them would forget, while the suited man stepped aside, allowing Elijah to move toward the aisle. And as he passed, students leaned back slightly, not out of fear, but out of quiet recognition. The atmosphere transformed completely from laughter to admiration, and Professor Caldwell stood near the board, the completed equation behind him, his earlier words echoing silently in the room as the authority he once held shifted toward the man walking calmly down the aisle, and the lecture hall remained still, understanding that everything had just changed. Elijah Brooks moved slowly down the aisle beside the man in the dark suit, the quiet rolling of his cleaning cart wheels echoing faintly behind him as the entire lecture hall remained frozen in silence. And Maya Thompson lowered her phone slightly, but did not stop recording, because she knew this moment would be remembered long after the lecture ended, while Professor Caldwell stood near the board, the completed equation still stretching across the white surface like a silent reminder of everything that had just happened. And as Elijah reached the front steps leading toward the exit, he paused briefly, turning back toward the room, his expression calm and thoughtful, and the students leaned forward almost instinctively, sensing that he was about to say something. And Elijah looked toward the board, then toward Professor Caldwell, and finally across the rows of students. "Mathematics does not care about titles," he said quietly, his voice steady and clear. "It only cares about understanding." And the words settled over the lecture hall like a final piece falling into place, and Caldwell gave a small nod, his expression now fully respectful, the earlier confidence replaced by something deeper, and Elijah continued. "Some of the best ideas come from unexpected places," he added calmly. And Maya felt a quiet chill as she realized the weight behind the statement. Because just minutes earlier Elijah had been invisible, another quiet presence moving between rows of desks. And now he stood at the center of a lesson no textbook could teach, and Elijah gave a final polite nod, then turned and continued toward the exit, the suited man walking beside him, and the doors opened softly as they stepped into the hallway, leaving behind a lecture hall that remained silent for several seconds longer, until a student near the back finally exhaled, and the quiet tension broke into murmurs, students exchanging stunned looks, some glancing at the board, others replaying the moment in their minds, while Professor Caldwell slowly uncrossed his arms and turned back toward the equation, studying it once more. And then he picked up the marker, adding a small note beside the final line, "Guess solution." He wrote carefully, and Maya smiled slightly as she lowered her phone, knowing she had just witnessed something rare, something that would stay with her long after graduation. And Caldwell turned toward the class, his tone calmer, more reflective. "Let this be a reminder," he said quietly. "Never assume who belongs at the front of the room." And the students listened differently now, their attention sharper, their perspective shifted. And outside the tall windows sunlight continued to move across the campus, while inside Whitmore Hall the atmosphere had transformed completely. And though Elijah Brooks had already left, the quiet lesson he left behind lingered in the air, steady and undeniable, a reminder that brilliance does not announce itself. It simply waits for the right moment to be seen.